I'll thank them also at the beginning of the public hearing, but I want to thank again the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Natural Resources for having hosted us in this fashion. It's a great opportunity to get rid of invasive species in real time. So, okay, so we are going to begin with a briefing. And these are the technical study on challenges in forest cover and tree canopy in Maryland, and we're being presented to by the following folks: Josh Bollinger, who's a communications coordinator at the Harry Hughes Center for Agroecology, and Susan Minnemeyer, who is a forest study lead with Chesapeake Conservancy, and some other folks who I'm not recognizing because my eyesight is going bad at my age. So why don't you all introduce yourselves and please proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing and briefing. I'll introduce, to my left is Susan Minnemeyer, who was the study lead for the Chesapeake Conservancy. To my second left is Dr. Aditi Dubé, who is a research assistant with the Hughes Center for Agroecology. And far left is Dr. Kate Everts, who's our executive director. I'll be providing you with the briefing today, and they're here to help me answer any technical questions that I can't answer.
Just to remind folks, this study was something that we commissioned as a committee, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I'll jump right into it. I have about 15 minutes. It's about a 150-page study, and I'll try to move through it quickly. But what I will say is we're always willing to meet after the fact. This is going to be a very broad stroke, so I can move through the results. But if any of you have questions after this, we'll be happy to meet with you at your offices, anything you need. So just say the word. Real quick, just about the Hughes Center, who we are. We're a University of Maryland affiliated nonprofit. We are 501c3. We work in Queenstown. Our mission really is research-based with outreach and collaboration intermingled in there, but we really do work to address some of the greatest research gaps facing Maryland in agriculture, forestry, and the Chesapeake Bay. Some of that is done at the request of the legislature, which is the case for this study. So we like to pride ourselves on taking a non-biased scientific approach to research so that policymakers such as yourself can make the wisest decisions possible with that policy. So we're here today to talk about Maryland's forests. And in order to do that, I wanted to provide you with some context here about just some of the forest policy on the books in Maryland. First, we have the forest conservation that are relative to this study. So the Forest Conservation Act of 1991, the goal here is to minimize the loss of forest resources during land development. So any activity requiring an application for a subdivision or grading permit, greater one acre in size has to go by this. So this act is implemented at the local level, but it sets standards for the identification, retention, and replanting of forests and trees when it comes to these development projects. So it requires a forest conservation plan that includes tree protection specification, mitigation planning plan, and I'll get to what mitigation is in a little bit, and a maintenance agreement, and that could be long-term, and it could be placed on retained forest and mitigation areas. Also pertinent to this study is the Forest Preservation Act of 2013, which is another policy to note. That really builds on the FCA, but it includes this concept of maintaining, of having no net forest loss and maintaining 40% tree cover of the state's estimated canopy. And finally, for the discussion of this is the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021, which in addition to the requiring of planting 5 million trees, permits retention banks authorized before December 30th, 2020 to continue selling credits until June 30th, 2024. And I believe you have a bill hearing related to forest mitigation later today. So moving on, this study was requested under legislation twice, recertified under the Tree Solutions Now Act, but you all provided us funding to get this done. And it really looks at all things forest in Maryland. I have the tasks up here. I'll go through them. Forest and tree canopy extent, forest health, our progress toward the bay restoration goals that were set, and then how that forest and tree canopy has changed over time, what sort of land conversions there have been. And then there's progress towards protected areas, mitigation, banking overview again, which I'll get to, which is one of the, which pertinent to your discussion today, and forest and tree planting program overview. So I'm going to go right into the key findings here. This is most important to discuss. So it's important to note that this is the most comprehensive study of its kind on Maryland's forest cover and tree canopy. Due to that scale, what resulted is an extremely nuanced study that looks at not only results at a statewide, wide scale, but also very regionally, very locally, and it looks at results there too. So what happens is there's wide variability between the data you're going to see in statewide data and your local data. It sort of tells two stories, right? It's telling us that if we're looking at statewide averages, as a state, we're sort of meeting our 40% tree cover goal. While we're still losing forests, it's found that over time, that rate is evening off and declining, okay? And the study points to some things that some of that has to do with the policies you're setting in place statewide and both at a local level. But it's also finding that we're still losing a lot of forests and fragmentation of forests. They're becoming smaller, more unhealthy. This trend is continuing, and this trend is significant in areas like Central Maryland, where we're met with high development pressure. So, however, we also find in the study that there's an opportunity for the state to transition from forest loss to tree canopy gain.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but
Sure.
could you define what you mean by Central Maryland?
Central Maryland, so the two highest levels of loss we found in Central Maryland were in Montgomery and Prince George's County. And I will get to, actually, I have a graph specifically that details the percentages of losses in each county, and you'll be able to see those skewed results by county. So just to show you really that this is science-based, we used 3 different data sets for this to come to find our conclusions. One is the Forest Service one that goes back 90 years. It's really a sampling. But the other 2 of this National Land Cover data set and this one for the Chesapeake Bay program are a little more high resolution. This one in the middle, we sort of consider it our medium resolution, but the one on my far right, the Chesapeake Bay program one, is very high resolution. You can really see change at a fine scale. So we use a combination of all this data to form our conclusions, and you'll see there are some varying percentages just due to, in forest estimates, just due to the varying degrees of data here in each of these data sets. So again, just to show you that our study is science-based. And now I'll get into the tasks. So this is what I was talking about when I said that the rate of forest loss has declined over time. So you can see here that all those data sets that I just referenced is an estimate ranging from 39 to 42% of the state's total land area is in forest cover or tree cover. So, but if you look at this graph, the green line is our forested land. The white line is commercial timberland. But the green line is what we're paying attention to here, because you can see that around the time of the Forest Preservation Act, which is the one from 2013, things really start evening out here. They're still going down, but they're evening out. So this is what I mean when I say, if you look at statewide data, it may not really be indicative of some of the local trends. Statewide data is telling us you're hitting the goal that you wanted to set, right? But the local trends, which I'll get to in about 2 slides, really tells sort of a different story, and may even point to some sort of concept where a one-size-fits-all approach to forest policy may not necessarily work and may need to be customized for the locales. So this is what happened to all those forests. It's sort of a very confusing slide, but the one thing I really want to point out to you, far left side, the very bottom green long bar, that's our forest cover and tree canopy for the state, and you can see that green swoosh on the bottom going over to the red bar developed. So forests accounted for 49% of all the land areas that changed in 2013, and so then the change-associated development was the largest reason why that happened. So, and this is with this high-resolution data that we use, the 1 meter scale.
What does the word production mean?
Production, I believe that's commercial forestry, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What does natural mean, since we have the chart in front of us?
Natural can either be, in some cases, we can't always tell the reason why the change happened, so it can be natural succession, like trees have blown down during a storm, or it could also indicate forest harvest. But not if it is distinctively forest harvest, like a large clear cut, that would be production.
The left side of that chart, is that all the land area of the state of Maryland, or what is that on the left?
It is the total of all land use classes that changed. Between the two periods of time. So out of all of the change, 49% of change happened on forests, and the resulting class, 38% total became developed. And more of that came from forests, but production also includes agricultural lands. I apologize.
Can you produce another chart like this, but which has the total land area of the state of Maryland before and after? Can you do that?
Yes, there is another table in the report that gives percentages of total land area.
I'd love to see another chart for the entire state of Maryland using that methodology.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Pardon me for interrupting.
No, of course. We can follow up with your staff in your office on that if you'd like, and send it to the committee as well. But I did want to point out a couple other trends. I mean, there's some slight trends you see here of trees, of slight trend of development to trees, that red swoosh to the green swoosh on the side, wedge swoosh on the bottom to the green swoosh on the side. And then instances of forests to wetlands, which could show instances of sea level rise in coastal communities. But this slide is part of what I was talking about when you are looking at the variability between statewide and local data. And this is what I was talking about also partly. There's another slide here that shows more of the skews, the trending skews. But, you know, we're seeing that really the greatest loss is in central Maryland. So when we break down these things regionally, we see two counties, Montgomery and Prince George's, accounted for more than 44% of the state's total loss to development, and 6 counties, again Central Maryland, around Central Maryland region, accounted for just under 70% of the loss. Those counties, and it's on the next slide again, but Prince George's, Montgomery, Anne Arundel, Charles, Calvert, and Baltimore County. So, and again, the loss there was most associated with development. So this slide shows the extent of forest and tree canopy loss from our multiple data sets that between 2013 and 2018, Maryland lost more than 19,000 acres of forest, but gained 6,100 acres of tree canopy outside forest. These are two different classifications of trees, right? Forest, they provide two different functions in our society, tree canopy outside forest and forests. However, it's important to note that a significant part of this tree canopy outside forest change isn't necessarily plantings, but it's forests that are being fragmented into smaller areas. They're becoming, it's too small to really meet the definition of forest. So, and there's issues with fragmentation with invasives and other things. So we're not necessarily gaining tree canopy in the desired way, essentially. But I did want to point out too, you see a large bar going up here on the lower shore. Lower eastern shore saw increases in forest cover. And the study cites that primarily due to the active timber industry down there. That's likely from harvested forest regrowth. It could point to some benefits of management of forest lands in that area. And here is that skew between counties. These are all the counties in Maryland. And you're seeing large losses in these central Maryland counties here, farthest to the left on the graph. So again, it's just to show you that there's a high variability between local data and the statewide data that we're seeing. For task 2, we were asked to investigate forest health. So this is another major finding of our report, is that forests are becoming increasingly fragmented in Maryland and becoming more and more patchy than they already were became more and more patchy between 2013 and 2018. They're turning into tree canopies outside forests, which leads to more isolated forest patches. This means less valuable habitat. This means higher vulnerability of the trees themselves. And we saw this trend, again, especially in central Maryland, where there was an increase in isolated patches, and there's a decline in core larger forests. So Also wanted to note that between 2013 and 19, Forest Service indicated approximately 12% of the forests in Maryland experienced recent disturbances, and invasives were one of the largest risk factors there. So again, this points to the importance of forest management, strengthening programs that promote forest health. And this is just to show the this is indicative of the patchy mosaic framework of Maryland here. You see some forest and tree canopy outside forest intermingled with roads and schools and housing and parking lots, and you see this everywhere in Maryland. So that's just to sort of show the wide scope view. We were asked to investigate our progress toward Chesapeake Bay restoration goals. Bay states have a goal each to hit 70% tree coverage in riparian forest buffer areas by 2025. Maryland's not quite there. However, again, high variability and high skew among local data. Some counties are farther ahead than others, and some aren't not far at all in this goal. So it's really, again, variability in data here, and I know I keep saying that, but there has been an overall loss of substantial net loss of the urban tree canopy. Again, that's really important to Bay restoration goals too, the expansion of the urban tree canopy. And while we're still however, we're still losing some trees in areas. There have been gains actually in some local smaller locales and places with established tree planting programs, even Baltimore City, places like Easton too on the shore, Chestertown, those places saw increases, and primarily due to the tree planting programs established there. Task 5, we were asked to investigate protected areas or protected forested areas in Maryland, excuse me. In 2013, 33% of Maryland's forest and 9% of its tree canopy outside forests were located within protected areas. And these areas experienced significant lower rates of forest loss and a much higher rate of tree canopy increase compared to statewide averages. And protected areas had a net gain of over 2,200 acres of total tree canopy. And this demonstrates that protected areas offer a source of tree canopy gain in addition to protecting forests from loss. So noting, however, the prevalent issues of invasives and other pressures, this study does recommend the management of these areas to be a priority. If you think of a forest as like a garden, urban vegetable gardens require care. They require weeding in order for what you want to grow to get the sun that it needs and to grow. So think of it as providing the maximal environmental benefits for what you want to happen on that particular patch of forest. Again, part of your discussion today in hearings is forest mitigation banking, and we were asked to look into this for Maryland. So real quick, what is forest mitigation banking? It's when in the Forest Conservation Act has reforestation or afforestation requirements for development projects to mitigate forest loss. So you either can do that on-site, you can do that off-site, or you can pay a fee in lieu of providing forest mitigation activities. So purchasing credits from privately owned forest mitigation banks is one off-site option. And we investigated two types of banks, planted versus retention. Retention banks are banks established from a current forest stand that's already there. Those are being phased out by 2024, according to the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021. So ones established prior to 2021 can still sell credits until that date. So our study looked at the capacity of counties across the state to receive banks and the locations of those banks. We found that there are about 17,000 acres of forest mitigation banks in Maryland, but 4,700 of those are active and available for the purchase of credits. However, these numbers have likely changed since the completion of this study. It looks at numbers through 2018. And this is stuff that's constantly updating. And again, part of the findings here is, we're really pushing for the continued monitoring of this kind of stuff so that we can come up with real-time data here. Next slide here. We also looked at the number of planted versus the number of retention banks. So again, those ones established from forest stand that's already there. Across the state, we found 81.1% of reported mitigation banks protected existing acres. So those are the retention banks that I talked about. Newly planted forest banks only made up 18.9% of forest banks, of acres. So our study suggests that there may be steps taken, may need to be steps taken to encourage planted banks. However, it is really, really important to note that retention banks have been important for places like Prince George's County, where they're experiencing rapid loss, and to protect forests or the forests that are currently there. So it's really just like a balance of priorities in these areas, and if you can customize these plans to what the particular area is experiencing. Next slide. So we were asked to overview tree planting programs. I have 2 more slides. I will say that for tree planting programs, this was incredibly difficult to get all the data for this section of the study. There are many, many tree planting programs on all levels, local, state, federal, private, nonprofit, what have you. And it was just difficult to do a comprehensive review on this. However, what we did find is that, and only 20% of the municipalities responded to this. So this points to, again, a need for a large-scale data collection effort on this if this continues to remain a state priority. However, what was calculated is we found that in 2018 and 2019, government and private tree planting programs were responsible for the planting of 1,800 acres, more than half of which was in response to the Forest Conservation Act. So this trend towards increasing in tree planting should continue and accelerate even with the implementation of the Tree Solutions Now Act, and that sets the goal of planting 5 million trees over an 8-year period until 2031. And our study also found that there's ample land providing an opportunity for planting trees, identifying over 373,000 acres of potential afforestation and reforestation sites in Maryland on non-agricultural lands, okay? So it also said that planting only 3.3% of the acres identified would enable Maryland to reach its Tree Solution Now Act goals. And in this photo here is just an example in the study we have of areas. The pink is the plantable areas in this section here of College Park, I believe, Baltimore City. So just an example of the types of stuff that's in this study here. And our recommendations here. It's also important to note that this study was not, the purpose of this study was not to suggest specific policy actions. The purpose of the study was to provide guidance and scientific analysis and context as in the future, you all are considering potential policies. So you can be guided by this science. So considering that, here are our recommendations. Consider how policies impact different areas of Maryland that are seeing different trends. Again, I pointed to that variability between statewide and local data, highly skewed. Consider programs and policies that will protect the health of our forests and reduce fragmentation. According to the University of Maryland Extension, most of Maryland's woodland parcels are between 1 and 9 acres in size. This increased fragmentation of forests creates issues with forest health. So, and again, invasives continue to play a detrimental role in forest health. And then continue forest monitoring. You know, this assures progress towards various environmental, economic, and social justice goals you all set in legislation too. And it helps to assess long-term trends and keep up to date on stuff so that we're not looking at data from several years ago now. And also, it would help setting up the purchase of mitigation banks too, because we also had a lot of issue collecting data for the mitigation portion of the study, because counties just weren't met to deal with, sometimes the staff isn't there to deal with the needs, something like this study. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you all have. And again, if you want to dig deeper after this, we're happy to follow up.
We have a couple of questions, and unfortunately, gang, we're going to have to get to our public hearing in another 5 minutes, but here we go. Delegate Healy.
Thank you very much, and I will take you up on having a one-on-one offline here about this whole process. I was very much involved in the creation of the study, and I put in bills until we got to this point where we needed this study and you have really objective data that we could use. My main question is about how, well, 2 things. If you could provide maps of these areas so we can see how this data looks. Because when you call something, Prince George's in Montgomery County, Central Maryland, most of us think of Central Maryland as Carroll County and that sort of thing. So a map would be very helpful.
Sure, I'd be happy to provide that.
And also to how you accounted for the federal property. I have a state park. I don't have a state park. I have a national park in my district, and the Beltsville Agricultural Research, NASA, the military bases all have. Some of them have quite extensive forest land. How is that accounted for in your data, and so when you're counting what was lost and what was not lost? I understand we don't have control of that, but we still need to know how the numbers work. So
You can answer that, Susan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the question. So for federal lands, the only property that we were not able to assess is Aberdeen Proving Ground with high-resolution data. The aerial photographs used in the study were not collected. Otherwise, federal lands were counted among other lands, although many of the properties that you mentioned would have been considered parts of protected lands. So for protected lands, we looked at properties that are owned as protected areas, but also private lands under easement.
okay.
And we looked at those as an aggregate of protected lands, and those were the lands we found net 2,000 acre tree canopy increase on.
If you could leave your contact information, and so we can get back. Probably more than one person wants to follow up.
Okay, great.
Okay, Delegate Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's also good to see some of my good Bowie friends out there in the audience as well. Going up to figure number 22, if you don't mind. Figure number 22 talks about, let me go back up. Figure 22, yes, figure 22, it's got the one that forest and tree, yes. On the y-axis, those units, I assume, are acres. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you very
Yes.
much, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You spoke often about invasive species putting risk in the forestry. Could you clarify some of what that meaning is with the committee?
The specific invasives?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes. There's a list in the full report of the specific species that were noted, but they include things like Japanese stiltgrass, English ivy, some invasive tree species like tree of heaven, and the only comprehensive data we had for the state was from the Forest Service, from their field sampling, and that's where they found 12% of forest plots had disturbance, and invasive species were the most prevalent type of disturbance. So a high level of prevalence of invasive species across the state, especially where fragmentation and development has taken place.
Thank you.
Can I just add?
Yeah, go ahead. Don't touch the button.
Okay. I'll just add one thing is this is the reason why we're concerned about fragmentation, because a fragmented forest, the invasives come from the outside. So if you have more surface area, if you have more edges on your forest in fragmentation, then invasive species are a much more serious problem. So that's one of the main reasons why fragmentation is an issue.
Thank you.
Before I recognize Delegate Ruth, how many acres in the state of Maryland total?
I believe approximately 6.2 million acres of land. Tables 12, 13, 14 in this study include the total land area.
Okay, great. And the other request I have is that chart that had the little swooshy lines going
Yes.
from beginning to end. If you could do that for the entire state of Maryland, I would
With
really
all land.
appreciate that. And
Okay.
Delegate Ruth has the final question, unfortunately, because we have an extensive public hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know if you can answer this, but one of the things that we've been looking extensively at is stream restoration projects, and sometimes there can be a significant removal of trees in there where there's obviously important goals to those as well, but looking at conflicting goals perhaps. And do you have any sense, or have you looked into whether those are having an impact on the fragmentation? And you also talked about the importance of riparian forest buffers as well.
I do know that there is a Chesapeake Bay Trust requests for proposals, and perhaps last year as well, a couple of studies looking specifically at stream restoration. So that was too fine a scale for this study, but I'm aware that it's a concern because of that study. So, but I don't have specific numbers.
Great,
on
thank
that.
you.
It is a real shame that we can't spend an hour or two on this alone, and perhaps during the interim, that's exactly what we ought to do over Zoom or something. But thank you very much. This is a very, very important study. I intend to read every word of it once I have an opportunity to do so, because it's fascinating and it's important. And again, I want to thank you and the entire Harry Hughes Center, and of course the Chesapeake Conservancy as well, for the tremendously important analysis that you've done here for us, and this is going to be the basis of much of our public policy. So thank you very much. And with that, we're going to need to be, okay, so we're going to adjourn, and in 2 minutes, we're going to start up for the public hearing. So don't go far. I'm going to go grab some